Good evening. Tonight, on December 31st, 1969, we're going to take a look back at the 60s and remember the good times throughout this past decade.
Good evening. Today, the first Super Bowl was played. The Green Bay Packers were versus the Kansas City Chiefs. It took place in Los Angeles in the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum. This was the most watched sporting event in the U.S. at the time. The Green Bay Packers had won the Super Bowl with a score of 35-10. Not only was football trending, but basketball was also becoming popular. The Celtics were the best team in the NBA. They were being led by Wilt Chamberlain, and they had won 8 championships at the time. Boxing was also becoming pretty popular too. Muhammad Ali, the best boxer at the time, was dazzling people with his fighting styles and his words in the ring. And that's it for the recap of the sports in the 1960s.
Good evening. Now we're going to take a look at the civil rights movement throughout the 1960s. First were the Freedom Riders, which consisted of both white and African American men who jumped on buses to try to force integration. Next was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which enforced voting rights towards blacks. They were free and equal in voting. Along with the voting rights came the forcing of integration in the South in public facilities. Another movement that swept across the nation, all coordinated with civil rights, was Black Power. It was a movement where blacks came out and stated they no longer fought for integration. They wanted equality, which was the whole point of the civil rights movement. Next, in 1967 came the Long Hot Summer, which consisted of many riots. Overall, almost 160 riots all across the East Coast and throughout the country. Finally, in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated by James Earl Ray. It was from here that the civil rights movement became extremely violent, and the blacks finally pushed for what they wanted for.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight marks the 1-year anniversary of our beloved President John F. Kennedy's assassination. As you all know, last year, November 22nd, 1963, our president was riding his motorcade through Peely Plaza, Dallas, Texas, on a political campaign, and he was shot at 12:30 p.m., and he was promptly rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 1 p.m. Lee Harvey Oswald, the suspected killer, was arrested for the assassination of Kennedy and the fatal shooting of a patrolman, J.D. Tippit, on a Dallas street shortly after. November 24th, Oswald was scheduled to be transferred to a county jail. Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner, shot and killed Oswald. Ruby died a short time later. Pop-Tarts.
As the decade draws to a close, we'd like to review a brief history of the Vietnam War, which still continues to this day. To begin, in 1960, when President John F. Kennedy first came into presidency, one of his first moves in Vietnam was to send several thousand U.S. advisors. These advisors were there to serve the South Vietnamese army and generally just train them, and serve as commanders and morale boosters to the much weaker Vietnamese army in its fight against the North Vietnamese army as well as Viet Cong rebels. After Kennedy was assassinated and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson took presidency, in 1964, a U.S. destroyer, USS Maddox, was attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin. This led Johnson to ask Congress for the passing of the new Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which would give Johnson the presidential power to send more troops to Vietnam to help fight a direct conflict. But this did not mean that anyone was declaring war. On November 2nd, 1963, South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem was executed by his military commanders, and the U.S. as well as South Vietnamese army took control of the South Vietnamese government. In 1965, the U.S. began bombing North Vietnamese supply lines, mainly in North Vietnam, but also ones that strayed into South Vietnam to generally just cut off the supply coming from the North Vietnamese army to the Viet Cong rebels. In 1965, there were 200,000 American soldiers in Vietnam by the end of the year. In 1966, that number doubled to 400,000. The following year, we had 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam, and the number was still rising. In 1965, by December, we had 200,000 soldiers in Vietnam. In 1966, that number doubled to 400,000. By the end of 1967, there were over 500,000 American soldiers in Vietnam, and the number was still rising, but would shortly decrease after. On January 31st, 1968, the North Vietnamese Army, as well as the Viet Cong, coordinated a strike on the Vietnamese New Year, Tet. This strike involved numerous South Vietnamese cities in which the North Vietnamese, as well as Viet Cong, launched full assaults on American positions, and thousands of civilians were killed in the conflicts. Despite Johnson's numerous attempts to negotiate with the North Vietnamese, no negotiation or agreement has been reached yet, but as President Richard Nixon gets ready to step into office, he promises that we will have a swift end to the war.
Good evening. Now we're going to take a look at one of science's greatest achievements. On July 21st, 1969, Neil Armstrong, along with Michael Collins and Edwin Buzz Aldrin, took the first steps on the moon. This mission was known as Apollo 11, funded by NASA. Neil Armstrong became the first man to set on the moon, saying the famous quote,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
The mission overall, Apollo 11, ended up taking over 8 days. The United States was the first country to ever send a man to set foot on the moon as of today. This achievement will live on forever.
Good evening. Today we have Private Kelly, a Vietnam veteran, and he agreed to an interview with us. How you doing?
Good, you?
I'm doing good, fine. So, what were your first months like in Vietnam?
Well, in the start, it was pretty good. We really enjoyed our time there. We would as soon as we were done with our training for the day, we'd head into some of the villages. We'd talk with some of the villagers, play with the kids. We thought it was like a day at the beach for us in the beginning.
That's for sure. What about the rest of the months?
Well, after the beginning, I'd say after my first few months, it started getting pretty bad. We started moving further north, and in the villages we walked in, they would start throwing rocks at us. And I remember seeing one of our American soldiers walked into town, and we just saw him beating some old lady. We tried to get him to stop, and it took us like 3 guys to get him off of her. When we asked him why, he was just freaking out. The war really gets to people, man.
Has being in Vietnam changed your perspective on the war?
Definitely. I think all we can do now is take our guys out of there. It's living hell over there. It's nothing like over here. We protest against the war, thinking that just because there's needless death there, but I'd say it's much worse than that. There's some serious issues over there.
All right, that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you.
No problem.
Good evening. On March 6, 1968, over 300 Vietnamese civilians were massacred by a U.S. military regiment. The Soldiers of Charlie Company, led by Captain Ernest Medina, executed several hundred unarmed and unresisting inhabitants of My Lai, just on the border of North and South Vietnam. The soldiers were told they were only to find enemy combatants and were responsible for a large number of Charlie Company's deaths, which is largely result of faulty intelligence. Regardless, the vengeful soldiers were unable to distinguish innocent civilians from hostile combatants and acted on their emotions rather than reason. These actions were entirely contradictory to the U.S.'s emphasis on the importance of human rights. Not only is Medina guilty of heinous war crimes, but every U.S. soldier who participated in the massacre is guilty as well. While Medina is largely at fault, so are the soldiers of Charlie Company as well. Since the Nuremberg trials, it has been established that just following orders is not a valid excuse for war crimes. Even if a soldier is directly ordered to do something that he feels is criminal, he can deny that order. While that soldier will be reprimanded by his commanding officer, but in an investigation, the soldier has defense. He would be guilty of nothing, and it would be the commanding officer who is prosecuted for giving a questionable order. Similar to the Nuremberg, the soldier of Charlie Company cannot use just follow orders as a valid excuse. Of course, most of these soldiers likely killed out of fear and were not heartless machines. When anxious for revenge, humans tend to be blinded in their wrath and are blind to reason. Still, as a soldier, one must be able to control oneself in situations such as My Lai and remain composed. It was the men's inability to use their own discretion as to whom the enemy truly was. Whether they consider their actions right or wrong, Captain Medina and the rest of Charlie Company are still guilty of war crimes and did little to prevent the massacre of hundreds of innocents. Thank you.
And that's all we have for tonight on this recap of this past decade.